we're live now, and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for this webinar. We're here to talk about holistic defence in the UK. My name is Sashy Nathan. I'm one of the co-founders of Clements, the criminal law firm for social justice. And we've got a dazzling array of speakers for you today, some not even in the UK. And why you've joined and why you've clicked to hear from us today is to find out more about holistic defence. What does it mean? Why is it important? And how do we do more of it in the UK? So by way of context, at Commons, we know from our sort of frontline involvement in the criminal justice system that the issues that some of our clients face are exacerbated by some of the failures in the system. During interviews we conducted in 2019, our clients told us that as a result of their involvement in the criminal justice system, they experienced increased levels of anxiety, there were pressures on their personal relationships and their employment situation. They also experienced issues with housing and financial situations, amongst other impacts on their mental health and well-being. We're acutely aware that clients often struggle to find the support they need outside of the legal system. And this in turn can affect their ability to engage with their legal cases and provide us the information and materials we need to sufficiently defend their case. So as a law firm that's committed to social justice, we recognise the interconnected nature of criminal law and the failures to address underlying socioeconomic and health needs. We believe the criminal justice system in the UK needs a more holistic response. And for those of you who are pretty new to the subject area, holistic defence basically means social workers working alongside lawyers, although it can mean many different things in many different jurisdictions. We're going to explore some of those issues today. It's pioneered actually in the US in particular by the Bronx Defenders Service, and we're joined by the Executive Director of the Bronx Defenders from New York, Justine Alderman. It's also pioneered in the UK in the youth justice system by Just for Kids. And we think we could do more in the adult as well as the youth justice system. So as we see that holistic defence has a bigger role to play in the future, and there is, as many of you know, a crisis in the criminal justice system in the UK. Recently, our work was recognised by Sir Christopher Bellamy QC, who was the government's commissioned independent reviewer of criminal legal aid. And so he wrote a bit about our model and about the potential of the model. And this was actually picked up, Commons was picked up in the Commons, House of Commons, in the Justice Committee, to be more precise. And we actually have a clip of some of the discussion to play to you, just so that you can get a bit of a sense of the political situation.
You talk at some length in the report about Commons law,
yes,
born out of Brooklyn Defenders as a model.
Yes.
And looking at what they do, it isn't just legal aid, as you point out. They're looking at a much broader range of problem solving, which struck me as being what I would classify as legal support, if not bleeding into what social prescribing, the latest, fashion, as it were. Certainly, I always viewed legal aid as being one bucket of political discussion, and legal support as always a separate bucket because it had a different funding source.
Yes.
Do you think we're moving to a point where, to properly sustain the criminal legal aid system, we need to abolish those artificial divides between legal support and legal aid? Is Commons law a model for drawing on both legal support and legal aid funding to buttress both together, that they are more sustainable taken in the round?
I think this is thank you for the question. I think this is a very important issue that needs a lot of thought, actually. We have, as you rightly say, we have civil legal aid sitting alongside criminal legal aid. We probably, in many cases, have, let us say, for argument's sake, a problem family. That might manifest itself in some family dispute that goes to the family court as on the civil system. It might manifest itself in a criminal case where somebody's been hit around the head, unfortunately, which goes on a completely different direction. But the central problem is the family. So I would say, and I think I found myself coming to this conclusion, that legal aid is not just the lawyer giving legal advice, but could and probably should develop into the wider legal support function that you suggest. And I think there are some good local solicitors who've seen that.
There you go, thought required indeed. And to help us think about these things, we have a panel. And I'd like to, just before I introduce the first speaker, I'd like to invite anyone attending to please submit your questions via the chat, via the Q&A function. And you can also upvote questions if someone else has posted a question that you support and would like to be answered. And we'll come to those at the end of the four presentations. So the first speaker is Justine Alderman. She's the Executive Director of the Bronx Defender Service in New York. She spent 2 years clerking for Judge Robert J. Ward in the Southern District of New York before joining the Bronx Defenders in 2000. After working for a number of years as a staff attorney, she became a training team supervisor for new lawyers, and then a team leader for experienced practitioners, and then the managing attorney of the criminal defense practice. Justine currently serves as the executive director and sits on the advisory board of the New York State Office of Indigent Legal Services and is on the board of the Chief Defenders Association. Over to you, Justine.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. And I loved hearing you talk about commons and the kinds of conversations that you have had with the clients you represent. And also just hearing that exchange in the video clip, because these are exactly the issues at the Bronx Defenders that we not only wrestled with when we first opened our doors back in 1997, but continue to revisit over and over again. So it might be helpful for me to share a little bit about who we are today and how we got to be where we are today, because I think a lot of times there's an assumption when people learn about our model that somehow we opened our front doors and on day one we looked the way that we do today. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And I guarantee you that if you invite me back 10 years from now and I give the description of what the Bronx Defenders looks like, it won't look like what it does today. And the reason for that is the same, sort of reason why we evolved this model in the first place, which is that we are constantly driven by this fundamental question of what is it that the people we serve need and want from their public defender office. And when we came to the South Bronx back in 1997, we knew, really just common sense that we could do better in our field, right? Even today, if you see any, especially American TV shows about public defense or movies that show a public defender, we're not exactly portrayed in the best light. And that same light that's the message that the people we are serving are getting about who we are, about what matters to us, about whether we're organized or overwhelmed or have too many cases or why we come to this work. And so we came to the South Bronx wanting to build on the best of what public defense had been around the country at that point, but also with this sort of burning question that we had to go to our clients to get the answer to. We couldn't come up with it on our own, which is, what do you need and want from your community public defender office? And when we did that, we heard things that were not terribly surprising to us, but had never been a real focal point up until that point of public defense, which is, of course, they wanted lawyers in the courtroom with a robust skill set to be able to thoroughly investigate their cases and to be able to develop the best defenses possible and have excellent litigation skills and be able to argue persuasively to a judge or to a jury. But they also wanted their public defender to understand and care about the drivers of their system involvement. They wanted us to understand the story that came before the moment they landed at the courthouse doors. And that meant understanding what those unmet needs are. There was just a reference to the family in that video clip, and what is happening with a particular family. That's a perfect example, right? What kind of trauma, unaddressed trauma is there in that family unit? What are they struggling with in terms of food insecurity or housing insecurity, right? What are the unmet needs in terms of physical health, mental health, education, economic opportunity? And not only that, to understand what the systemic drivers of system involvement were, like over surveillance and over policing of that family, of the community that that family comes from. And so when we heard that, we knew that we needed to develop a very robust social work practice to be able to talk to clients, to understand what was going on in their lives. And sometimes that information really would help shape the trajectory of a case. It might help us figure out what a creative resolution might be if a client did not want to go all the way to trial. They didn't want to litigate their case. They were looking for resolution. How could we do it in a way that we could actually help this person get on a better track? How could we help them get the resources, the services, the support that they need to try to ensure that they don't keep cycling back through the criminal legal system? And at the same time, for us at the Bronx Defenders, it also meant taking a broader look at what the societal issues were and beginning to deeply understand what those drivers of system involvement were from a state intervention standpoint, that kind of surveillance over policing. And how could we, as an organization that's representing over 20,000 people a year, how could we take our proximity to the people who are being driven into the criminal legal system and use it to try to turn off the spigot, right? How can we try to help advocate for changes, either in policing practices, surveillance practices, what we criminalize, how we address what we criminalize, in a way that could actually help create an off-ramp to the criminal legal system, like in just shrink its footprint. But the other thing that we heard when we talked to clients, and this was much newer to us, and I started the Bronx Defenders back in 2000. So 3 years into our existence, I started as a young public defender representing low-income people in criminal cases. And what they helped us realize is that we had traditionally been operating in the criminal legal system almost with like blinders on, right? That the criminal legal system kind of stood alone, that it was distinct from these other legal systems that just got mentioned, the civil legal system, the immigration system, the family court system. And that when we were done resolving a case in whatever the best way we could within the confines of criminal law, we were done. We had done our work. That was our area of expertise, and we could walk away. And I can't tell you how many times I resolved cases thinking I had done my client a great service. I had helped them avoid prison or jail. I maybe helped them avoid, and right, we have misdemeanors and felonies. Maybe I helped them avoid a felony. I got it dropped down to a misdemeanor, and I walked away patting myself on the back feeling like I had done a good job. And my client thought that I had too, only to discover years later that that plea, let's say to a misdemeanor drug conviction, ultimately landed them in deportation proceedings, or got them evicted from the only home they had ever lived in, or launched a child welfare investigation that ended up leading to family separation. And so when we think about why do we as defenders come to this work, right? It's not just to show off our skills in the courtroom, it's to help people. And the last thing we ever want to do is leave people worse off than when we met them because of our own ignorance, because we weren't seeing how interconnected these systems are, right? That a case in one jurisdiction, in one venue, in one courthouse could lead to legal entanglement or have life outcomes, right? That actually put people in a worse position. And so we developed this model that you referred to, that it's called holistic defense. And that model is premised on the idea it doesn't have to look the way it does at Bronx Defenders, where we represent people in all of these different areas, right? We have an immigration practice and a civil practice, a housing practice, a family law practice, and a criminal practice. It doesn't have to look like that. But what we were realizing is that to adopt a model of holistic defense where we widened the lens and widened how we saw our role, that it sort of required 4 fundamental pillars. So one of it is figuring out how can we provide people with seamless access to services that meet a whole array of their most pressing legal and social service needs. Again, that doesn't have to be all under one roof the way we do it at Bronx Defenders. That can be building partnerships with other organizations and helping clients access those services in other ways. It requires advocates with an interdisciplinary skill set, right? So if my expertise is criminal, if I don't know what questions to ask about how my client's housing, if I don't ask them and discover that they're in public housing, I might not realize that misdemeanor drug plea that I am suggesting that they take could lead to their eviction. I have to know enough about these other areas of law, about how these things are interconnected, right? So that I can advise my client about what some of the implications are, what some of the things are that the client wants to consider, and help them figure out what's most important. Is the most important thing to me staying in my home? Well, then that may influence either how I, as their lawyer, advocate for a case outcome in a plea bargain, or it may mean, you know what, we have to fight this to the end. Because if this person ultimately gets evicted from their home, it's going to unravel everything and leave them much worse off. And it also requires that those of us who have different skill sets, like, if I'm a criminal defense lawyer and Sue is a family, defense lawyer, that we are in constant communication with each other so that we are centering the client in a way to make sure that Sue and I aren't working at cross purposes. And then the last pillar of holistic defense is making sure, and this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that we have a robust understanding of and connection to the community we serve. Because if we understand that, then we understand what those drivers are of system involvement. It helps us be better advocates. It helps us build better trust with our clients. And it makes it more likely that they will feel comfortable telling us about all the different issues that are going on in their lives. And so we started off being 25 people who are only representing clients in the criminal legal system. And now today, 25 years later, we are 400 advocates, non-lawyer advocates, lawyers, social workers, investigators, administrative professionals. Today is Administrative Professionals Day. So happy Administrative Professionals Day to anybody who's on the call. And we are working in collaboration with each other in all of these different arenas to try to meet those various legal and social support needs that our clients have. So I'll stop there. I know that's a lot already.
Thank you, Justine. That was a lot, and I imagine there's going to be lots of questions, which I encourage people to ask, and there will be opportunity, obviously, to have responses to those questions at the end of the presentations, but you can ask them as we go along in the Q&A chat function. The next speaker we've got is Professor Luke Clements, who is the Chair in Law and Social Justice at the University of Leeds School of Law since January 2016, in fact. He was a practicing solicitor between 1981 and 2021 and had conduct of a number of cases before the European Court of Human Rights. He's a patron of the Disability Law Service and a special advisor to the Spinal Injuries Association. And his research interests concern the role of the law in both exacerbating and combating the social exclusion experienced in particular by disabled people and their carers. He is also the author of a recent book, Clustered in Justice, a copy of which I have with me now, and I would encourage you to read. Sue has one as well. It's very good, and it was published in September 2020, and insightful on how the single issue lawyering approach, I think that Justine perhaps spoke to just now, does not address the social reality of people's joined up problems and why focusing on systemic change. So without further ado, over to you. You're on mute, Luke, I'm sorry.
Can you hear me now? That's good. Thanks very much for inviting me. Thanks for that sort of fascinating introduction, Justine, and what you're doing sounds awesome. It's a real pleasure to be invited to speak. I come at from a different point of direction in a way, as Sashy has explained. My background, although I did my statutory 10 years in the criminal law courts, learning how to humiliate myself, I moved on to other things. And so my experience is largely acting for disabled, elderly ill people, disadvantaged people, as I call them. And a lot of my work in the European Court of Human Rights was for Roma and other minorities. But I can understand, I think what this resonates very strongly with people within the criminal justice system. One of the really influential things that happened to me as a young lawyer was to read Stephen Wexler's landmark sort of paper in the Yale Law Review 52 years ago, I think he wrote it, about lawyering for poor people. It's one of the most inspirational papers that I've ever come across. And Stephen talks about the fact that we as lawyers are trained largely to deal with law school problems, the problems that the normal person comes across, the will that they need, or the conveyance they need, or the divorce they need. And these things come across well-spaced intervals. And we return these people to the normal lives of people who live in, these adverts in happiness. And he was just saying, for poor people, and for me, my book is more about people who live with disadvantage. They don't necessarily have to be poor. I work a lot with parents of disabled children who are bumping into the law all the time in education, housing, adaptations, social security, social welfare, health. They're grappling with an impossible system of multiple synchronous problems for which the law is ill-equipped, and law school graduates are ill-equipped because they are trained to fragment, to separate complex, messy problems into their constituent parts. And we are trained as that in lawyers when we go into civil court to have our heads of damages, and each one's discrete. And it doesn't have any of those interconnections that Sashy and Justine were talking about. And of course, simplifying problems into their constituent parts is a valid mechanism in much of life. It just really doesn't work with complex, messy problems where you resolve a problem, but there's 4 other ones. And as soon as you resolve that problem and you walk away, as Justine was saying, and I've done it many times, thinking, oh, it was a great win, and the sun will now rise happily. And of course it doesn't, because another problem's already come along and fill that vacant space. And so in systems thinking terms, in sort of, which I find is fascinating, their idea is that you don't simplify by fragmenting and separating, you simplify by effectively zooming out and seeing the whole picture. And by doing that, you don't lose those incredibly important interconnections, which in the law, which is largely, as the name of my book says, which is the bowling green, is loaded. It's loaded to give poor outcomes to disadvantaged people. That's the whole point of the law, is to embed privilege. If you break down the interconnection of justice and you can't see the bigger picture of the fact that somebody may be before the justice system, but they were abused as a child, they've got complex health problems, and they've got financial problems, and they've got all sorts of other compound messy problems, you lose justice. Effectively, justice is lost. And the whole of our system is sort of, the neoliberal system is to is Fordist in sense of creating a conveyor belt where everybody does one thing. You've separated it down rather than having lots of people with particular skills to deal with separate issues. And I've seen that in my time as a lawyer over the last sort of 40 years, where you did used to have in the UK a collection of experts who could do housing, who could do crime, who could do those things. Now the system doesn't really allow that, and you have different offices which deal with that. So and we very much got the law center, the call center approach, where an individual has to call a different call center to get a particular problem. And they're confronted by individuals who, very nice, most of them are my grandchildren, but they have no idea about the complexities of living those lives. So they'll give them answers, but they're answers to the wrong questions effectively. And it's only when you've been in and asked those questions repeatedly, and you have a thing in systems thinking called failure demand. You keep going back because you actually haven't got the answer that you need. Do eventually you kick the door down and you speak to an expert who's in the back room, who can tell you actually what your problem is, what you needed to know, because the ones at the front really haven't got those skills. So in the book, I describe what I don't like, but I also try to describe what would work. And I think in terms of what would work, and it's not just in criminal law, I think what Justine and Sashy, and I'm sure Chris and everybody's going, is what you're doing. In relation to a lot of the people I deal with, I think a very core part of that is what Justine was talking about, was connection in the community. I think having support groups, which is easier for parents of disabled children, or perhaps Roma or some communities, to have support groups of people who have those experiences and can tell you what actually your problem is, because you might think it's this, but actually there's a bigger one coming across the horizon, your eviction. And this may solve this, but might lead to your eviction, as Justine was saying. It's those support groups, those user-led experiences that can help individuals as well. So yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and I'm so glad that you've arranged this talk. So thanks very much, Sashy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Luke. And just a reminder, you can ask questions about anything that Justine and Luke have said as the session continues. I'm going to introduce our next speaker now, who is Sue James, who many of you on the webinar may know already. She's the Chief Executive of the Legal Action Group. And prior to this, she was Director and Solicitor at Hammersmith Law Centre, where she specialised in housing law. She's a founding trustee of Ealing Law Centre and has worked in law centres for most of her career. In 2017, she won the Legal Aid Lawyer of the Year Outstanding Achievement Award. She's also co-editor of the Legal Aid Handbook and Justice Matters, and writes, speaks and campaigns on access to justice, housing and legal aid. Sue was also a Winston Churchill Memorial Fellow in 2018. She visited Health Justice Partnerships in Australia and an organisation called Trusted Help in Ontario, Canada. And she's going to speak, I think, a little bit around that and about legal aid. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you, Sashy. I've also got some kind of lurgy coming on, so if my voice goes, then apologies for that. Justine, I thought your talk was really interesting, and I've been following the Bronx Defenders, and so really brilliant to meet you. And I've obviously met Luke before and read his book, which is fantastic. I knew that you would mention Stephen Wexler, so I haven't, but I often mention him now in terms of you know, what he was saying like 30, 40 years ago is still so relevant. And the context that I'm going to speak in today is really about that, because as a frontline housing lawyer in a law centre, working kind of at the coalface in the county court on duty solicitor, we've had 10 years of austerity and more, and also the legal aid cuts. in 2013. And so increasingly what I was seeing was that people were turning up at court and not being able to get the help that they needed. But also their problems were clustered. They weren't just a housing problem. You know, there was a family matter, you know, it was caused maybe by the employment or a lot of the time by the benefits, failure to pay benefits. And it seemed crazy that people were being forced into the courts and forced into a position where they were facing eviction, which was also causing a lot of stress and anxiety, when their problem wasn't that problem. It was a benefits problem or another problem that they needed resolving. But increasingly, there was nowhere to send them because legal aid had reduced so much that what do you do? And one of the things that I did through Ealing Law Centre was we got some funding to have a crisis navigator and came up with this term. And what happened, I could see in benefits, and especially I think when we had universal credit came in, was that it was such a complex benefit and people didn't understand it. I didn't understand it at first, and I was looking through people's journals on their phones and stuff, and it was just like different payments being made each month, and there was a complexity there, but it wasn't necessarily a legal problem. And so we got this funding for a crisis navigator who used to come to court with me on Fridays on duty solicitor days. And he was just amazing at kind of sorting out that kind of murky, non-legal, but kind of would have legal impact. And so I just thought, what can I do? How do we make some change here? And started to look at health justice partnerships. So they'd started in the US, but had taken off really big in Australia. And I decided to go to Australia because the health system kind of replicates that in the UK, and we could learn lessons from Australia that I think we could use here. So I applied to Winston Churchill for a travelling fellowship, and I have to say that if you've got an idea, go and do it, because there were 1,000 people and 100 places, and luckily I got one of them. And I spent a month in Australia going across from Sydney, Alice Springs, Darwin, Melbourne, looking at these projects. So health justice partnerships work essentially by embedding legal help into healthcare provision. And often what you see is that people don't know they've got a legal issue that needs resolving, especially in social welfare. So they tell their doctor. So lawyers, community lawyers, were going out to where people were already accessing services. And the first project that came about was essentially one that involved family violence. And it was in the Women's Hospital in Melbourne. And lawyers were there behind the scenes. And when the women were going to get help because they had been hurt through family violence, a lawyer was there and they were asked if they needed help. And, you know, so that kind of took off and developed. So while I was in Australia, there were a number of brilliant projects, and I haven't got time now to tell you all of them. But first up in Melbourne was particularly interesting, and I think for this audience today, but it looked like a house on a tree-lined street, and it had a multidisciplinary team that supported people who essentially had health and addiction issues, but had come into the practice through criminal charges. And their philosophy was that complex people need complex solutions. And doctors, psychologists, nurse, therapists, care coordinators, lawyers, all under one roof, employed by one organisation. And it gave, the one-stop venue gave people, vulnerable people, access to the support, as well as a transfer of trust. And this is interesting with and what you say, Justine, but a transfer of trust and knowledge between practitioners. And so that you could really understand how you needed to slot into supporting this person and what other people would do with that. Another project was Stepping Stones, which was a co-location of financial counselling and family law legal advice. And often with coercive control, there's a lot of financial issues at the end of that relationship. And by combining the financial counsellors with the lawyers, that helped to resolve the problem. There was a fantastic project in Katherine, Australia, run by a doctor. And so normally I'd spoken to lawyers. This was the first time I'd got a doctor. And essentially, he came into the Health Justice Partnership remit because he just thought it was just incredibly stupid spending hundreds of thousands of pounds treating people to discharge them to accommodation that was insecure. He mentioned one case where there were 30 people living in a 3-bedroom house with no air conditioning and no fridge, and that person needed kidney dialysis. So, it's not joined up, and we need to be thinking more about those kind of joined up provisions. And then one of the interesting things, I ended up being in Darwin, and someone said to me, you need to talk to legal aid. And I said, why would I need to talk to legal aid? And in Australia, legal aid is dispensed differently. They have a really joined up approach. So unlike the UK, where legal aid is contracted out to private practitioners, Australia has a mixed model delivery, and it combines in-house public legal advice, assistance, legal clinics, community legal education, and health justice partnerships. And interestingly, they said to me, we don't trust private practice with the most vulnerable. We have to do it through legal aid, which is completely different to how we do it here. So quickly, the UK does have health justice partnerships, but they're quite fractured. Dame Hazel Gann, the professor at UCL, has been kind of pioneering this here, and she did a mapping exercise in 2018. So what I could do is kind of put into the chat if people want to see that kind of mapping exercise. And then we've got the couple of projects that I mentioned that are being kind of set up in the last year. We've got Maternity Action. I've got a new project combining a service in Cheshire and Merseyside's Women and Children's Hospital. And they're integrating advice, my voice is going, into maternity services. So women are turning up, they're losing their jobs because they're pregnant, and having a lawyer there really helps to kind of, resolve those issues. And then Southwark Law Centre in London has got a project with a hospital and supporting people who are homeless. So essentially, once a patient's ready for discharge, if you've got nowhere to go, the same problem that Simon Kilty had, what do you do? How do they, where do they put their medication? What do they do with that? So having a lawyer there to support and get accommodation has really made some change. Essentially, I'm going to just say a couple of words on legal aid. It doesn't work in the UK anymore, and I think we need to think bigger and bolder about what we do about it. And Lord Mackay said in 1991, we're just about at the limit of what is possible with legal aid without radical change. And if he was saying that then, we absolutely are now. What's interesting is that New South Wales have come up with in Australia have come up with a new model of delivery of legal aid, where they documented legal need in order to ascertain what was required for the service. And legal needs research was something that we did very much here. Hazel Gann did it quite a few years ago. There's just been a new legal needs survey that's been started in Melbourne in Australia. But essentially, that's the kind of thing that we need to be doing here, looking at the legal need and how it needs to be addressed in order to then decide on what the delivery model is. And Jane Sippance, who heads up Legal Aid New South Wales, she said that people dip into legal aid in different ways. And so she said that when they were designing their services, they thought that they could do a linear model, but that didn't work because, I'll quote from her, people dip in and out with different needs and different vulnerabilities at different stages in their life and on different legal issues. And so the model they came up with looks like Sydney Opera House, with the client at the centre and the services designed around it. And I think, that's what we need to be asking for now, is like a new method of delivery of legal services that combines holistic defence. It combines the civil aspects as well as the criminal aspects. And I think for too long, we polarised, legal aid has been seen as like an issue about delivery or eligibility or remuneration, but actually it's really interconnected with poverty and health and other legal policy. So I'm going to stop there now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. A lot of things for everyone to think about from Sue's talk. And the last speaker, who's going to speak a lot about what he actually does day to day, is my colleague at Commons, Chris, he's titled our Crisis Navigator, but it may be that title changes at some point in the future. I'll just give you a short intro to Chris's background. He works alongside the legal team, as I said, and his background is in Mental Health Act and Care Act advocacy, working in secure mental health settings and in the community. His experience of supporting people with varied and complex needs, secure hospitals and in community care settings. This has seen him support people with challenging detention under sections of the Mental Health Act, secure access to appropriate housing, challenge inadequate care provision and deprivations of liberty, and navigate complex safeguarding cases. He's also worked with parents and children engaged in family proceedings. So Chris has got a vast amount of experience, and he's going to talk a bit more about what he did at Commons.
Thanks, Sashy, and yeah, thanks everyone, Justine, Sue and Luke. Yeah, very nice to hear you all and share this platform with you. So yeah, as Sashy said, I'm the Crisis Navigator at Commons at the moment, and hopefully I'll just give you a bit of insight into how the service runs at present, talk a bit about sort of the ethos and the ideas behind developing that service, and hopefully a bit about how that hopefully benefits some of the people we work with. The service, I think, has been around at Commons now for about a year and a half, 9 months or so of a pilot, and then a period of kind of reflection and reporting, and then my time here is coming up to about 5 months with the service. So in that sense, I think it's good to point out, it's very much a work in progress, and it's a developing service, one where we're really keen to learn from other people as we build it, from the professionals like today, as well as from people on the ground that we're working with, as kind of Justine outlined in the development of your service. I think that's maybe the most important thing to be attuned to as you go. And I think I should also, I also want to say, learning from the work that my predecessor Amanda did on that pilot, developing it, building this really strong ethos into the work, and developing really good relationships with the people that they were supporting. So to start with, I guess some of the fundamentals that I think run through the service as we offer it day to day is really trying to center it on each person's needs at the point at which we meet them. I think that's really the main aspect of the service, in my view. It's focused on kind of developing a non-judgmental space for the people we work with, understanding the kinds of structural violence that people will often be facing in the criminal justice system, and seeing how that impacts upon them as an individual, and then trying to make plans really to support people through those processes. So in that sense, it's a project that's kind of necessarily about insisting on taking each person in a holistic sense very literally, that all their needs are acknowledged and that we try to address those as fully as possible. In terms of a bit of a practical overview, the service is offered to all of the new clients that the solicitors at Commons meet. I'll try and meet them at the earliest possible time, normally alongside the solicitor wherever possible. I think really that it's crucial to meet people as early as we can, to build that kind of trust and rapport that the role needs. It's kind of come up in various ways in the things that all three of you have said so far, that I think that trust is really important. The legal work, I think, has quite a clear pull for a client, right? They need legal representation in the moment, but the work of offering the crisis navigation support, I think you're asking a person to kind of develop a certain type of interpersonal trust that you don't want to force or rush, I think. So my first focus really is always on getting to know the person a bit, build that solid basis for the start of a working relationship. And then you can get to the real business of sorting out what sort of support is going to be helpful for that person. And often there is some fairly immediate practical support or intervention that the person themselves can identify. I think probably some practical examples might be helpful here to illustrate. So at the moment we're meeting a lot of people with pretty messy housing needs, unsurprisingly, especially in London, I think. So, you know, we'll have someone who's lived between, say, 3 addresses over the last 10 years. They don't have their own place. They're reliant on maintaining those 3 respective relationships to have somewhere to sleep. And so when it's working fine, it works fine. But you know, as you talk to that person, they themselves say, this isn't stable for me. And they make it very clear that, you know, it's not, they'd like something that has more stability. So in that sort of case, you know, I'll work with that person, contact the local authority, go through their housing process. You know, this is, you know, in this sort of case, someone would have a very clear entitlement to a local authority housing stock. And I'll work with them through that process, and then, you know, gradually kind of check in as they go and see how things are progressing, potentially attend meetings if it's helpful, and work towards a kind of clear conclusion. And then other cases where you maybe have a less clear cut situation, or someone's in housing that's like entirely unsuitable, you might be looking at things like helping people push back a bit against the housing association. And then it's maybe more about joining them up with more appropriate specialist legal advice, taking that situation further. And my role then is maybe to step back a bit and just keep checking in, checking how those new relationships are being built. And that's the sort of approach, I guess, that kind of runs across all practical issues like welfare benefits, access to food and clothing, urgent needs, finding discretionary funds and that sort of thing. And I think it's probably worth pointing out here, like, I think that sort of practical support has interacted with the legal casework. I think, you know, if those material and practical things can change a wee bit, it can make it a lot easier for people to engage with their legal casework as well. I think, you know, if you can find ways to bring a bit of balance to an area of someone's life where it's previously been a big source of stress, that can sort of free them up, I think, to better engage with the legal work. And I think it's very clear, obviously, we all know from our respective experiences that the legal issue will also be bringing its own stresses. So any way in which sort of practical support can take another bit of strain away, I think helps free someone up a wee bit. And really on that note, the other main aspect of crisis navigation as it currently stands is kind of the ongoing emotional support that it can offer, alongside those immediate practical interventions. You know, lots of the things we're doing are looking longer term, you know, maybe things like pushing for access to more specialist mental health support, or, you know, substance use support network and so on. You know, these services will have their own processes that can take time, referral, assessment, and implementing the work. And in that case, you know, the ongoing support that we can offer through crisis navigation, I think, is really vital. You can create space for people and hold that with them and give them some room to just breathe a little bit more, I think. And I think it's worth mentioning here, like, to reference something Sashy touched on, that I think in 2019, when Commons were interviewing former clients, and I think at least in part with a view to developing this sort of holistic offer, I think a lot of people were making it clear that ongoing emotional support would be a really important and necessary thing for a holistic service to offer. You know, obviously, we know a lot of people coming into contact with the criminal justice system will have pre-existing needs of some kind, as the language goes, but I think we really, you know, have to acknowledge, as others have, that the criminal justice contact with the criminal justice system itself is a source of stress and anxiety. It has a real impact on people's mental health. So a lot of my time, it also goes on just kind of, creating that space, holding that with people and giving them room to offload, as well as like discussing more concrete support, or, you know, techniques for handling stress in court. You're going to hear some difficult things said potentially about you, or things you've done, and how you can work your way through that collaboratively. The final point, I think, just to quickly mention, is also the ways I talked briefly a bit about the more indirect ways I think the support can help with the legal case, but in the spirit of it being a kind of new thing that we're developing, that one of those aspects, more experimental maybe aspects, is like trying to find ways that we can more directly support the legal case. I think off the back of things like mitigation reporting that I think are more established practices in the States, trying to find a way. At the moment, we kind of frame it as a crisis navigation report, where it's appropriate, and, you know, kind of discuss it with the solicitor, see whether we think it's going to be helpful. You know, because we have probation, often we're involved, and there's going to be maybe expert reports going on, and as well as the legal advocacy. I think from my point of view, it's about trying to find somewhere in between those things where you really just are able to create some space to insist on the person that's at the center of it. Obviously, the court has the legal facts, but I think it's really important to try and create some space to insist on just like the facts of that person's life, the context as they see it, on their own terms as much as possible, to insist on kind of remembering the person at the middle of all of it. So I think ultimately that's what the crisis navigation service at Commons looks like at the moment, trying to focus on centering people, giving them impetus and control to make decisions and control processes as much as they can, acting as a bit of a facilitator to access to other services, and also a non-judgmental listening post, holding that like dual function really of giving practical support, putting people in touch with services, doing a lot of that legwork to take the strain away, hopefully, and then holding some of the emotional weight that the person might be carrying, and then looking towards ways that we could use that to have hopefully a wee bit of a positive impact on the legal case. And that's me.
Thank you, Chris. Obviously more information, if you'd like to learn more information about crisis navigation, illicit defence as it is currently involved at the firm, just get in contact with I or even I'm going to use the time we have, sort of roughly just under 10 minutes left on our webinar time slot to address some of the questions that have been asked. There is one particular question which has been upvoted 3 times, which puts it at the top of the pile, and this is towards Justine, actually. The question reads, how does the funding work for state-funded defence in the USA? Are public defender service providers always non-profit or for-profit organisations? One of the main difficulties I can see for this approach, which I applaud and fully support, and I've always tried to follow in my practice in the UK, is the lack of funding. We are simply not paid for what we do and what we should be able to do to support our clients. And the second question, Justine, is how do you practically explain illicit defence to new clients, especially those who are pleading not guilty? How do you present it in a way which doesn't come across as judgment?
Great question. So first to the funding question, in the US, we're a mix of nonprofit and government agencies. So the Bronx Defenders is a nonprofit that contracts with the city of New York to provide legal services. But we are able to fundraise for additional support. But the truth is that the vast majority of the money that goes towards holistic defense does come from the government, even though we're a nonprofit. And it didn't happen overnight. In the very beginning, essentially what would happen is the government would give us a certain amount of money to represent a certain number of people, but they didn't tie our hands in terms of how we spent that money. As long as we represented the number of people that we were contracted for, they didn't really care how we spent the money. And so we made our own decisions about things like having, it sounds very similar, to the work that was just described, having social workers, more social workers than maybe another public defender office would choose to have. They may choose to put their resources towards lawyers. And we really saw the value of having social workers help both on that, the emotional experience of going through the system, but also helping to address some of those underlying issues. So even though we're a nonprofit, we did find ways of using our funding for the development of holistic defense. We also did it through relationships and partnerships with fellowship programs. So I don't know what kind of fellowship programs are available in the UK, but for example, like every project we started usually started first with a fellow. So we would have one person who came who mapped out all the collateral consequences in the civil realm of criminal justice involvement. We had one person doing a pilot project on representing parents accused of abuse and neglect. So we always start really small, might be just a single person. We provide sort of proof of concept. We sort of track the work that they're doing and then try to use it to make the case for additional funding. The other thing I would say that might be helpful to those of you who actually have the opportunity to advocate for funding for holistic defense is that a study came out a number of years ago by the University of Pennsylvania and the RAND Corporation that studied our holistic defense model and found that over a 10-year period of time, our model ultimately ended up saving the government $165 million in incarceration costs. So if you're looking for those to appeal to those people that are looking for cost savings measures, the investment in holistic defense actually reduces incarceration and therefore reduces, the cost that the government is spending. On the question about clients, it's an excellent one, right? We don't want to come in the first time we meet clients with a social worker suggesting that they need social work support and help, or need support and help in other arenas of their life, especially given the fact that, at least in the US, most of the social workers that our clients have encountered before they've started working with us are people who have done harm to them and their families. They don't look and sound like the social workers at the Bronx Defenders. And so when we first do an intake with a client, we will ask a series of questions about things that are going on in their life. And I will always say to a client, first, I'm going to ask you a series of questions. They are not going to sound like they have anything to do with your criminal case. But the reason I'm asking them is because actually your criminal case can lead to all sorts of other issues in your life. And I want to make sure that the decisions we make today are informed by the other things happening in your life, so I can make sure that we don't do anything together today with respect to your case that is going to make anything else going on in your life worse. So let me start by asking you, where were you born? Right? And I sort of do that as a way of kind of just providing a backdrop for why I'm asking the questions. And then also we'll let them know that we have social workers who tag team with the lawyers on a team-based model. If they are interested in working with a social worker or talking to a social worker, that's available to them. I don't sort of push it on them, but I make sure that they know that that is an option and that we have all those services available.
Thanks so much, Justine. There's a couple of questions as well, perhaps Sue, you could answer these. The first one is, what do you think the best way of training a holistic lawyer is? Do we specialise too early? Do we train on the job more? Is there a particular skill set we need to look for? And then also, there's a follow-up question about whether you've written about these approaches, I imagine perhaps Australia and
Okay, thank you. I'll start with the second one first because that's the easiest. So I have written about it in for different publications, but Winston Churchill, you have to do a report at the end if you want to get the medal that you get for traveling. And I'm in the process of finalizing it, so we'll be up on the website. So that's a place to look for any of the Winston Churchill Travelling Fellowship programs that are funded. And I think, there's quite a bit. I mean, if you want to contact me directly, then there's other kind of ways in as well, and the stuff that's been going on in the UK, and there's some bits of studies there. How do we train lawyers? It's a question that I got asked at the Socio-Legal Studies conference 2 weeks ago, because obviously there's an opportunity now for lawyers to study in a different way. Whether or not law schools will do that is another matter. But essentially, I think it needs to be, there's talk of kind of lawyers studying with doctors or social workers so that you're learning those combined skills. There was another project in Melbourne where there were studies with projects with nurses who were representing. So you need to have empathy, you need to understand your client, you need to be working within the community where your client is. So we need to do much better than we're doing now. And I don't have all the answers for training, but I think we need to start looking at that and thinking about it, so we haven't got the law school model that Luke started with the the one person who comes into a legal office and has one solution, one problem that needs a solution. It needs a combined approach, and combining all of this. And Justine has said, you learn a lot from your colleagues. And I think there needs to be a way that we train together to get those skills.
Thank you, Sue. We're almost out of time. I'm just going to ask one quick question that's just come up, which I think either Luke or Justine might be able to speak to from their own perspectives, is how can barristers specifically encourage clients and or solicitors to engage in a holistic approach to defending? The Magistrates Court, for example, prioritises speedy justice over anything. I'm interested in hearing how we as advocates can push back on this. So experiences of speedy justice, which is often in opposition to
I'll just say one of the things that the judges hate most about us is our relentlessness. They always criticize us as slowing the process down. There will be some clients for whom speedy justice is the most important form of justice for them. And those are people usually where you can resolve the matter pretty easily without doing harm. But for most of the people we serve, and we're like, this issue has come up a lot about complexity. Our clients come to us with a complex set of problems, and our legal systems are not designed for complex solutions. And sometimes the way I talk about it with lawyers is this idea that like we are part of the system, right? There's a lot of criticism sometimes of public defenders. Do we hold up systems of injustice by agreeing to play this role, by standing by people's side? What if everyone refused to do it? The system would break down. But our founder, Robin Steinberg, used to like to say, and I have adopted this, it's like we are part of the system. We are in some ways a cog in the system, but we're sort of like an intentionally deformed cog, right? Our role is in fact to make it difficult for the wheels of injustice to harm our clients. And so part of being a holistic defender is recognizing that you are of, and yet at the same time, antagonistic to the system in which you are operating, and to get comfortable knowing that the goal is not to be a seamless part of the system where everybody appreciates the role that you play in the system, but to be a kind of disruptor within the system. And oftentimes that does not equate with speedy justice.
Thanks so much. We've run out of time today, and thank you all for attending. Thank you to the panelists for offering so many varied and deep insights into how we start to do more holistic defence in the UK. Watch this space with comments. Sign up to our newsletter. Email us. Call us if you like, if you want to know how we get this funded and how we get this developing and evolved is obviously an ongoing question, but we know that collaboration will provide some answers to those questions. So thanks everyone, have a good evening. And
Good night, everyone.